The Nvidia GeForce Titan X, now known as the Titan X Maxwell, was the best of the best back when it launched in March of 2015. That makes this card going on 8 years old at this point, and despite the older tech it sports, it still has the horsepower to punish games in 2023. It may not be at the high settings anymore, but you may be surprised how the card holds up considering its age. Before we get into this video, I want to say not to forget to leave a like and or a comment, especially if there's something you think I missed with this card. I also wanted to make known the state the card was in when it arrived. I ordered this card knowing that it wouldn't have a fan or a shroud, but what I didn't expect was for them to ship a replacement fan with it, along with the heatsink. I'm not complaining, but what you'll see in this video are numbers from a mod I did to make the card work without overheating. And as such, I'm able to clock the core a solid 300 MHz above stock. This may not sound like a lot, but for a Maxwell card, which sits stock at around a gigahertz, 300 MHz is proportionally a lot, so performance will obviously be skewed more positively. I think it's important to mention, and I definitely recommend a mod like this if you want to get the most out of your card. Long term, I'd probably also run heatsinks on the memory, but for the week or so I had it in my system, it was perfectly fine. Without anything else to say, let's dive into the Titan X. The core specs for this card are actually rather competitive for newer cards from any of the three big players. Though despite the card's lower IPC and overall lower clock speeds, the width of the pipelines on offer are comparable to more inexpensive offerings from the prior Ampere and RDNA 2 generation. With a fully unlocked 28nm GM200 400A1 graphics processing unit, this card comes with literally a perfect Maxwell 2.0 sample. It's not cut down at all, and as a consequence we get 24 SMs, equating to 3072 CUDA cores and 192 texture mapping units. While this card doesn't offer Tensor or RT cores, what it does offer is a GPU optimized for power efficiency on an older lithographic process. Keep in mind, consumer Maxwell 2.0 utilized TSMC's 28nm process, which could only print planar transistors. Nowadays we have 3D FinFETs, which are more area and power efficient, but that doesn't mean that this card can't perform well. What it does translate to though is overall lower clock speeds, and even though the base clock of a flat 1 GHz is kinda low for 2023, its boost clock of 1089 MHz also isn't blazing fast. Keep in mind though that this card with the water cooling mod can clock up to just under 1400 MHz before crashing or causing a weird Windows error. And while this is closer to a lot of the base clocks for lower end Pascal cards, for Maxwell this appears to be pretty average for what most Unlocked GM200 chips are capable of. I didn't do any crazy shunt mods or other power delivery changes besides increasing the power limit in MSI Afterburner, though I couldn't increase it by a ton because of the PCIe Power connectors. Unfortunately, the original Titan X models only featured an 8+6-pin PCIe Power configuration. This limits the card to pulling 225 watts from the external connectors and up to 75 watts beyond that from the motherboard's PCIe slot. This means the card can pull up to 300 watts before it becomes concerning that you're drawing too much power from any particular rail, which in operation never occurred. Even with the almost 30% overclock to the core, power draw spiked to just under 260 watts at 4K in Cyberpunk 2077, but in most games hung out between 200 to 225 watts. Feeding the card power is one thing, but also keeping it cool is another challenge. If you're sticking with the stock Founders Edition blower style cooler, then you're going to be thermally limited under load in almost all scenarios. However, if you have one of the special third-party heatsink designs or have an AIO for it, clocks, and conversely power, will increase since the card is actually being properly cooled. I mean, this makes sense, integrated circuits after all need to be actively cooled by an appropriate heatsink. And while this Founders Edition design may work for a 1070 or even maybe a 1080, it's just not adequate for any card with a TDP at or above 200 watts. There's just not enough surface area to transfer the energy from the chip into the heatsink and then into the air. A larger heatsink, or an AIO in this case, increases the overall surface area available to dissipating heat. For actual compute tasks, the stock Titan X features an FP32 throughput of just under 6.7 teraflops, and a little over 209 gigaflops of double precision FP64. With our overclock, FP32 throughput increased to a little over 8.57 teraflops, while the FP64 increases to a strong but not spectacular 267 gigaflops. These aren't really helpful numbers when comparing to cards outside the Maxwell 1.0 or 2.0 generations, but within the aforementioned series of cards, this is by far the most powerful single GPU solution available at the time. Along with the standard compute throughput, the Titan X also features 104.5 gigapixels per second and just over 209 gigatexels per second of respective pixel and texture fill rate. This is predictably behind the Titan X Pascal, the Arc A750, and also surprisingly the GTX 1080. It's not anything to worry about, as it's still more than enough to power 1080p texturing and shading, but it'll become more restrictive at higher resolutions, despite the card's rather beefy cache and memory configuration. Coming in with a standard 48KB of L1 cache per SM, this specification looks pretty close to Nvidia's later gen Pascal, and for all intents and purposes, it's almost identical. The actual instruction set that the GPU is able to execute, though, is more restrictive with Maxwell over Pascal. Where Pascal introduced the now hot-button DP4A instructions, Maxwell actually lacks them, meaning that Intel's ZSS in particular runs relatively poorly. For DirectX compatibility, the card technically supports DirectX 12, but only really DirectX 12.1, and not the DirectX Ultimate 12.2 update. This means that hardware-accelerated ray tracing and specialized tensor operations are just not possible in the same way that they're possible on newer Nvidia hardware. You can technically run them on the regular CUDA cores, but there aren't any fixed function circuits like the ones introduced with Turing, RDNA 3, and DG2. The L2 cache has also been slightly reshuffled from Kepler, this time being doubled to 3 MB on die. This is all being fed by the then standard 12 controller wide GDDR5 memory config, clocked at 7 gigabit per second. This leads to a 24x4 gigabit memory topology, which is kind of cool to look at since the card is covered on both sides by memory chips, but also means there is an insane amount of parallel bandwidth for this being regular GDDR5. Keep in mind this also came out a year before the introduction of GDDR5X. With a stock bandwidth of just under 337 GB per second, it comes ahead of the GTX 1070 by a pretty solid amount, and also ahead of the GTX 1080 by about 16 GB per second. If you've got heatsinks on the VRAM, then pushing the modules up to 8 GB per second would bump you up to a solid 384 GB per second, which is ahead of the RTX 3060. You also get a 12 gig frame buffer, as compared to the 980 Ti's 6 gigs, which for games is nice to have, but is ultimately irrelevant since the GPU on board isn't powerful enough to be able to utilize the full buffer. It's sort of like a 3060 situation. But what I can say is the memory size helps tremendously in programs that like to store a lot of data in it. Something like, DaVinci Resolve, which I personally use the most, wasn't necessarily faster, but there was less of those stutters that occur when the program is streaming in data. The Titan cards have always been marketed as gaming and productivity focused cards, and this larger memory buffer just keeps it more relevant for those of us that make use of larger datasets. Another quick spec I want to mention is this card is connected to the rest of your system by a PCIe 3.0x16 connection. For the majority of gamers this should be fine, but just know that while ReBAR may technically work in theory, it probably won't really work in practice, which is fine because this card released well before this was a thing. It shouldn't need it to attain more performance, but from basic testing I found that the setting doesn't really affect performance when either on or off, so I've just chosen to run with the setting off. This leads to the test system, which is the i7-11700K ROG Strix Z59EE gaming Wi-Fi build, utilizing 64 gigs of 3200 megatransfer per second DDR4. The i7 is set to turbo all-core to 5 GHz when it's able to, and then 5.1 GHz on cores 0 and 1, hopefully to remove some of the bottleneck of this being an older CPU. To stream data to and from memory, I've got the PCIe 4.0 Western Digital Black SN770 1TB, which even for games that are notoriously long to load, like GTA 5 and Red Dead Redemption 2, they load pretty quickly on this drive, and I ultimately have nothing but positive things to say about it. Our boot drive is on another NVMe drive, but only a PCIe 3.0 Samsung 970 EVO. It's still fast enough to prevent stuttering caused by idle tasks starting up, and also provides tons of available bandwidth to feed both the memory and the processor. The system is run off an EVGA 650W PSU that I've had for a few months, and overall power wasn't an issue for either our CPU or the GPU we're testing. To test our games, I have everything set to the low setting except for textures and anisotropic filtering, for which I have set to the highest respective value. This is to take advantage of the massive frame buffer on the card, but also preserves graphical quality without actually turning up a lot of the settings. It just makes materials look better, is all. All the games will be tested at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K to see how the card scales with resolution, and gain an idea as to which you should target if you're eyeing one of these cards. Without any further ado, let's dive into the benchmarks and see how the once fastest GPU in the world fares against some games. In typical ProCTech fashion, the first game I fired up when I plugged everything in was Apex Legends. There were some initial performance issues in this game that I was honestly worried were hardware related, but after DDUing the drivers and reinstalling them, everything worked flawlessly, and delivered very playable performance at 1440 and 1080p. 4K performance was kind of poor, with an average and 1% low of 49 and 38 FPS, and even the maximum of 71 isn't particularly impressive. But the average of 82 at 1440p and then up to 118 at 1080p indicate that the core on this card itself is powerful and is able to shine when there are less bandwidth restrictions in place. It's not what I would consider a consistent high refresh rate experience, but it definitely gets the job done if you're short on a GPU and need something to get back into Apex on. It's at competitive or low settings, but it's solid performance and is something you could probably expect out of a similarly priced 1070. DICE's most recent entry in the Battlefield series, Battlefield 2042, performed playably at 1080p, though it was only averaging 84 FPS and had a 1% low of 59. This isn't exactly going to drive a 144Hz display, but it's a superior experience to the Xbox One or PlayStation 4 version, and I'd honestly take it over either of those simply because I'd have the additional customizability. 1440p, while it looks playable, having an average of 60 FPS, the 1% low tells only part of the story, and it coming in at 44 seems a little high from what I experienced, mainly because it was stuttering a lot, especially when I aimed down sights. If this game is too much for the card to handle and you're looking for a smoother Battlefield experience, then the older Battlefield 1, which actually released a little over a year after the Titan X, performed incredibly well, which makes sense given both the age of the hardware and the software. With an average and 1% low of 177 and 115 FPS at 1080p, performance was never unplayable. And if you wanted the most consistent experience, then a variable high refresh rate 1080p monitor would allow you to smooth out some of the stuttering that happened in the data. 1440p averaged another very playable 144 FPS, and even 4K pulled an average of 86, showing the power that this card has to dominate in older and still very popular DirectX 11 titles. Borderlands 3, a DirectX 11 game once again running at the low settings with ultra textures and materials, and at 1080 and 1440p the Titan X returned playable performance. 1080p's average and 1% low of 131 and 83 FPS both hint at almost locked high refresh rate gameplay. The card gets very close to being able to support locked 120Hz gameplay in this game at 1080p, but it falls short sometimes. Realistically, I'd be fine playing this game on this card, and even at 1440p, the average and 1% low of 94 and 68 are beyond playable, though not high refresh rate. 4K was also console playable as well, or what do they call it now? Cinematic? It doesn't really matter, but if I had a controller to use, I'd be perfectly comfortable to use it on this card at 4K, and you can get a decent feeling response time at any resolution. Up next is our first CryEngine game, and despite its notorious reputation, the remaster we're testing is actually better optimized than the original release. Crysis Remastered, built using DirectX 11, returned playable performance at all the resolutions tested. 1080p was by far the most playable, with an average and 1% low of 179 and 73 FPS respectively, But we seem to have been running into some CPU limits given that the 1% lows improved going from 1080 to 1440p. 1440p saw the average and 1% low come in at 148 and 114, which is still very respectable given this remaster came out 5 years after the card. 4K was also playable, with an average of 76 and a 1% low of 59. But if I had to choose, I'd probably stick to 1080p at higher quality settings and at a locked 60 FPS. This game ran pretty well overall on the Titan X, but it's hard to recommend picking it up if you're looking to play Crysis Remastered. There are just more powerful cards on the market. Cyberbug 2077, a game that's probably going to go down as a similar situation to the original Crysis, performed pretty decently at 1080 and 1440p, but rapidly degenerated at 4K. I've brought this up before in other videos, but Cyberpunk is just one of those games that still feels fine to play at 30 FPS. The average of 66 at 1080p show that the Titan X is more than capable of powering through at around 60 FPS, and while raising the resolution to 1440p kept the average at 51, 4K's average of 28 was just unplayable, and the responsiveness of the game varied wildly. Cyberbug may feel fine at 30 FPS, but it just doesn't feel fine below that. While I want to blame the poor performance on the game being built on DirectX 12, in reality this game just runs poorly no matter what card you play it on, so it's definitely not unique to this older Titan X. It may be exacerbated by this card featuring an older microarchitecture, but overall the code still runs so it's hard to complain. Maybe don't pick up a Titan X Maxwell to play through Cyberpunk, but if it's all that you've got, then it'll get the job done as long as you stay in the carpool lane. Fortnite, our first Unreal Engine 5 title, ran well at all the resolutions tested. 1080p saw a respective average and 1% low of 177 and 68 FPS. And while the 1% low indicates that there was some stuttering, this was during the landing phase and didn't occur during regular gameplay. Everything ran smoothly, and even though it is at competitive settings, some frames could be gained by going into performance mode, which disables even more of the graphical effects. 1440p saw an average and 1% low of 125 and 57 FPS, which, while worse than the 1080p numbers, once again I want to state that the 1% low stutter occurred when landing and when the entire map is in view. So, for most of your match you won't be running into this issue. Moving into 4K, and performance was playable, but I'd rather stick with 1440 or 1080p. This time, the 51 FPS 1% lows occurred during regular gameplay, and the stuttering that started but went away at the other resolutions was persistent throughout the entire match. This is probably because the older card is struggling in the now somewhat demanding though basic looking game. But even at the low settings we're testing at, the game still looks pretty good, and it's hard to complain about how the game renders its world. The next two titles I decided to merge into a single benchmark last video, and I think I'll do that again this video because the performance between the games was almost identical. Modern Warfare 2 and its new Battle Royale counterpart, Warzone 2.0, performed well at lower resolutions but struggled at 4K, and also a little at 1440p surprisingly. There has to be some sort of bottleneck in the GPU itself that is limiting performance, because the 1% low at 1440p of 51 FPS didn't improve when dropping the resolution down to 1080p. The average certainly improved going from 65 to 94, but at these competitive settings I'm wondering if we're hitting a CPU bottleneck that's holding back the minimum performance. 4K saw performance dip down significantly though, and for a competitive shooter it becomes hard to recommend as it's just too low to be enjoyable. The average of 40 and 1% low of 24 showed that there was stuttering occurring as well, meaning that performance will generally look worse than the statistical average. Overall, Warzone 2.0 was fun at 1080p on the Titan X, but if you want to get into this game as an esports player or a content creator, then there are much better and more value-rich cards available out there on the market. COD runs, don't get me wrong, but it's not crazy levels of performance, and not to mention the game doesn't look all that great. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, another Unreal Engine title, except this time on the 4th iteration. 1080p saw the card return an average of 219 FPS, which for a competitive shooter is right where a lot of people are looking to play it at. The 1% low of 87 indicates some dips in performance during gameplay, but like in Fortnite, these dips occurred during the landing phase of the match and never became an issue during regular gameplay. Jumping up to 1440p, and the average dipped down to 148. while the 1% low hung out at 69 FPS. This is still high refresh rate playable, but if you want to get the most amount of pixels for your money, then 4K delivers more playable performance figures that make me comfortable recommending the game at these settings on this hardware. With an average and 1% low of 80 and 41 FPS, it's not ultra impressive, but for a more budget-friendly card, this is pretty impressive, and the 384-bit bus really gets to flex its muscles here in this workload. Once again, would I recommend a Titan X Maxwell for a new budget build in 2023 to get into PUBG? Probably not, but this would still be an excellent start. Our next two titles I decided to bundle together because they're games built on the same but upgraded technology. Red Dead Redemption 2, Rockstar's last generation magnum opus built on Vulkan, performed playably at all resolutions, though I would recommend avoiding 4K. The average and 1% low of 77 and 66 FPS at 1080p are beyond smooth, and the fact that this newer-ish game is able to run this well on this hardware is pretty impressive, especially when considering the quality of the pixels being rendered. 1440p remained playable, with an average of 55 and a 1% low of 47, but I would say enabling FSR might help to stabilize or raise your FPS to a locked 60. 4K was also technically playable, but in reality performance hung just below the 30 FPS mark a majority of the time, despite the average coming in at 31. This may lead to some pause, but keep in mind that FSR 2.1 is supported on this card, and it works pretty well in this game. It may be worth enabling if you want some more stability in your experience. Piggybacking off Rockstar's Rage engine, the prior generation's GTA 5 running on DirectX 11 performed incredibly well, so well in fact that at 1080p we're running into the engine frame rate limit and running into massive stutters. Why the game does this, I'm not quite sure, but it's apparently been documented for years at this point, so the fact that it does this isn't really that strange, but it doesn't make it any less annoying. Either way, the 1080p average of 167 show that the game cruises along without an issue on the Titan X, and even dropping down to 1440p, the average only dropped to 148. 4K was also playable, with the average of 77 and 1% low of 60, showing that it never dropped to quote unplayable levels throughout this test run. Overall, I think that in both Red Dead 2 and GTA 5, 1440p is probably the sweet spot for gamers looking for a compromise between visual fidelity and performance, and the figures collected today support that conclusion quite well. The last game on today's benchmarking suite is the recent release Sons of the Forest. This survival game, being built on DirectX 11, really helps a ton for older GPUs, but it doesn't save the card we're testing today from the lowest settings. At 1080p, the Titan X returned an average of 78 FPS, which is beyond the playability threshold, and the 1% low of 58 indicate that while there was some slowdown, it wasn't super noticeable. 1440p lowered the average to a flat 60, but the 1% low of 46 was much more noticeable. Things didn't feel as smooth as at 1080p, in the sense that frame times felt more sporadic, but all in all it was still very playable at this resolution. 4K was also sort of playable, however the average and 1% low of 43 and 33 FPS were lower than what I would personally feel comfortable with. If you're looking to get into Sons of the Forest on the Titan X Maxwell, then stick to 1080p as you'll get the most consistent performance with the most headroom. This game is one I've never really thought I would like, but after some playtime and building a log cabin, it's definitely more interesting than I originally thought. In a nutshell, the Titan X is the strongest and best aging Maxwell 2.0 graphics card available, but just because it's the strongest from its generation doesn't make it an automatic good buy. For the price I picked this card here up for, you could arguably pick up an RX 5600 XT, which would honestly slaughter the Titan in performance and especially efficiency. This card in context though offers performance that's on par or slightly faster than the GTX 1070, which makes sense considering it's delivering a wider but ultimately slower clock chip in almost every aspect. But the older lithographic process combined with the overall older Maxwell microarchitecture means that the card draws more power than the aforementioned 1070. Power consumption and performance per watt is becoming more of a concern in markets outside the United States, and while the power draw was impressive when it launched back in 2015, it's not as impressive now when there are newer standards that are not only faster, but draw significantly less power. it's just a less efficient solution. And with the Founders Edition heatsink and fan, performance will be thermally constrained in almost all scenarios. If you want to do a mod like the one I've done in this video, then you can squeeze some more performance to get it to sit above the 1070, but still significantly below the 1080 in the relative power ladder. If you're dead set on picking up a Maxwell GPU in 2022, then the Titan X definitely would be an interesting choice, but the GTX 980 Ti is the obvious and more abundant alternative. In terms of performance, a non-reference, non-blower style card will usually outperform the stock Titan X, just because it has additional thermal and power headroom. As a result, unless you're really an enthusiast, or you're me I guess, then picking up an original Titan X Maxwell is just a cool thing because it was once heralded as the fastest GPU in the world. It still evidently has the chops to tackle games at 1080p, but the older memory standard, combined with the overall depressed clock speeds of Maxwell when compared to newer offerings, just make the card a hard recommendation in 2023 unless you need the VRAM. It's an interesting find nonetheless, and I'm glad that I've had the opportunity to test fully Unlocked Maxwell 2.0 in 2023. Honestly though, keep an eye out on server farms because they've got some really good stuff. So thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and click the bell icon so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. Let me know what you think of the Titan X Maxwell. From what I experienced with the card, which was using it for a little over a week as my main card, and it could do literally everything that my previously reviewed 1080 could do. Admittedly not as performantly, but it still works. Maxwell is definitely aging, but it still has a few more miles left in the tank. Either way, thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.